All right, so we talked a little bit about that multi-generational thing and the clients that you've kind of cultivated over the years. Mm-hmm. And this is why, even with the internet and the ability, like with social media, to market, I can market my work there, is that I believe, and you mentioned like justifying your existence. I'm going to justify it, on why I believe in a gallery is important, and that's for those relationships and for those reasons. Like you mentioned with the interior designers, a lot of them, the majority of the people that are following me on Instagram are other artists, right?
Right.
They aren't necessarily interior designers and, the types of clients that you've cultivated over the years. And so in a lot of ways, can you kind of talk about that a little bit? Like,
yeah, it's a very complicated question, and it's something that I do a lot of thinking about. So I'm going to try and boil down my ideas into something
that'd be great. Yeah.
That is useful, because I know that this is something that artists think a lot about too. And there's a lot of feelings people have about dealers, and a lot of feelings that dealers have about artists and how sales happen.
Right.
And they're well-earned feelings, right? These aren't casual. Yes. And this is something I think that is just the nature of the disruption that technology has brought along. Right. It has largely given artists more power, which is good. Right. More control over who they are and who sees their work. Yeah. But it also doesn't fulfill all the promises that it makes. Right. So if I did my master's and PhD in London, and I spent a lot of time with galleries and auction houses there. I've got friends who run galleries in New York, Miami, and Basel, in Maastricht, and you name it, all the top places.
Right.
And they are really catering to the top 100 names in art, in contemporary art, right? And if we were to talk about those top 100 names, the relationship they have is pretty clear. It is, let's say I'm a gallery in New York, which I'm not, but let's say I was a gallery in New York.
Right.
And I have a calendar. I have a social calendar of shows that I have.
Right.
And I schedule those out, and I have maybe one show for every working month of the year. Because remember, my clients are very wealthy, which means they take summers off, mm-hmm. and they take Christmas off. Mm-hmm. So I'm really only dealing with 8 months of the year. And I have an evening each one of those months. And that 1 or 2 evenings each month, those, which is, 8 times 2. Right. Yeah. I do 90% of my business on those evenings.
Interesting.
Right. Yeah. I have a pre-show, and my clients who schedule it as a social calendar event, and budget their time, mm-hmm. and their incomes to say, okay, this year I've got the Banksy show coming up on, they're in November 18th. I am going to spend my $9 million of this show every year, right? And it's crazy how that world works. That is how it works for the top 100 names in art.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. There are thousands, tens of thousands of artists who are trying to get in that top 100. Right. And there's a feeder that goes into it. You go to the Rhode Island School of Design. Out of those, 1.1% of the Rhode Island School of Design then get a show at the New Museum, and then it goes from the New Museum to the gallery in Chelsea, and then then those people build up a following. Right. That is not the reality of most artists. And in that scenario, it really makes sense who your dealer is.
Yes.
Right. And it makes sense for you to spend all your time making art and not making phone calls.
Correct. Yeah.
On the other end of it.
Can I just say one thing about that is that it can eat you alive. I mean, it's a lot of work, right? You spend all day, every day doing that kind of stuff. And that's where an artist can really benefit doing what they do, and you doing what you do. And one other comment I'd just like to make, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that too, is that like places like social media and Instagram, these really high net worth people are spending zero time on these social media platforms, right?
Oh yeah.
They have maybe even if they have a presence, it's they have somebody that's hired to post for them and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
So that's one thing, that a gallery does is really, the things that you've cultivated over the years. They're never going to find out who I am unless I'm in a gallery relationship, right?
It's funny. There was a study that was done recently that showed that, I'll give an example that is, it's depressing, but it gets better. So don't be too depressed as I share it. That the Louvre was trying to adjust traffic patterns because they realized that people were piling up watching the Mona Lisa, created a traffic jam in the museum. Mm-hmm. And they estimated that people spent an average of 7 seconds looking at it. And they thought, how do we get that down? How do we get the 7 seconds down?
Interesting. Yeah.
And they said, okay, well, we're not letting people take photographs now. What'll happen to the traffic patterns if we let people take photographs? So they decided to let people take photographs, and they got it down to 1.3 seconds.
No kidding.
Because if people take photographs, they can just take a picture and say, saw it, moving on.
It's all about selfie, right?
And it went from me taking the picture of it to taking a picture of me in front of it.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that took it down to about 1 second. Right?
No
so
kidding.
they made sure they left room for people to have a selfie moment.
Right.
Take 1 second, goes through. So seeing Mona Lisa takes 1 second. The amount of time people spend looking at an image on Instagram is 0.3 seconds.
Wow. Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So you're not having, and also they say that marketing studies have shown over the decades, this has not changed regardless of how much social media has stimulated us.
Right.
That it takes an average of 7 experiences with something before we buy it.
Yes.
Right.
You have to have this kind of relationship with it.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
and is that even more for luxury goods, or they say
it's still 7, but
okay.
the time that it matters the kind of experience you have with it.
Okay.
If it's a luxury good. Right. And artwork is largely a luxury good.
Yeah.
And so it dramatically increases the sale of it if your first few experiences are non-physical and then you have a physical experience with it afterwards that reinforces the other experiences you've had. Mm-hmm. So, if you're having one of these galleries in New York in the top 100 names, you're relying a lot on multiple stimulations before the person actually gets there. So if I'm a dealer, and I rely on these same dynamics as a dealer, I am expecting that they're looking at my social media feeds. They've looked at a newsletter I've sent them. I've had a phone call with them about it often. They've come into the gallery. They often come in once by themselves on a lunch break. They'll come in again with their significant other who they share their space with, right? Their partner, their spouse, their boyfriend, their girlfriend, whatever. And they'll have another discussion in front of it and they'll buy it. And it's very rarely that money is the issue.
Yeah.
It's usually that they've had multiple experiences with it.
Yes. And they it's just that attachment to it they have that is more important, right?
So I'm going to give you another example. I gave you the example of the gallery being necessary because they create the event with the Rolodex of the right people in the room, right? The perfect network. Yeah. The other example is I remember there was an artist who I admired a great deal. He was internationally renowned. He'd won a number of contests. He was admired by other artists. And he was based in a fairly rural area of people who where there was a dearth of galleries. There wasn't really any serious galleries to meet his level of performance.
Talent.
Right.
Yeah.
But he chose to live in that area for whatever reason.
Well, and a lot of artists do because it's cheaper to live out, further away from like the city center. Right. I seen even, New York artists will eventually move outside of New York because, why pay the super high rent? Once they've established the relationship, kind of move out into the countryside. Right. Yeah. Right.
So this guy had a couple relationships with dealers who were not good relationships, and it happens. They were terrible experiences. The dealers never paid them for the works they had sold. They'd said, sorry, but we had to declare bankruptcy or whatever it was. And
there's a whole lecture that kind of conversation that could be about what to avoid about gallery relationships and like red flags and things like that. Right.
And I think that's such an important discussion.
Yeah.
And he unfortunately had these kinds of experiences, right?
Yeah.
So he said, I'm not going to go with dealers anymore. I'm going to do it all on my own. So I had gone out to his house just because I had admired him. And I knew he wasn't going to be interested in me representing his work. And frankly, I didn't know if I wanted to represent his work. I just admired him as an artist.
Yeah, you can love the work, but you also have to fit it in the gallery as something. Hey, this is a thing that I can sell, right?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
So he is now 25 years into his career as a serious artist. And I said, so I see a lot of work that's on the floor here, right? And and this is before social media, really, right? I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, I've got a few students that are supplementing my income, but I spend really, maybe 20 or 30% of my time making work and 70% making phone calls to the same 80 people.
Yeah. Wow.
And I said, well, what is the range of those 80 people? He said, well, I found that most of them will buy a work a year from me, and some of them have as many as 15 or 20 of my pieces each.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. So he said, what I'm spending my time doing is I built up my own book and I'm painting more and more for those people. That small group there. Yeah. And this is the Seth Godin model. Seth Godin used to be a marketing guru back in the day. He helped build the brands originally for Yahoo, and then he was brought in to help with Facebook and various other brands over the years. Yeah. And he said that the best publishing model is to have one bestseller and capture that audience and then to continue to publish to that audience.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is an echo chamber.
Yes.
And that's not a bad thing necessarily, because if you've got a huge audience and and they love what you're doing, they've basically subscribed to you. Right.
Yeah.
Right. But you're not really growing that audience that much, and you're painting to their tastes.
Right.
And that has got legacy issues potentially, because then it means
it's just this tiny group, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I have artists who will come to me and they'll say, who have done this for years, and they'll say, it'll go a couple of ways. One is they'll say, I've been selling my work for $2,000 on average a painting.
Right. Yeah.
And I'll say, well, if you had been in my gallery, we would be selling them comparable works for 7 or 8.
Yeah. A whole lot more. Yeah.
Yeah. You'd be making a lot more money for it, and you'd be spending more time making art.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Than trying to sell it.
Yeah.
Because you haven't been comparing yourself. Because I'm dealing with collectors who are seeing the comparison in quality to other people, and I can immediately tell you what your prices should be.
Yes. Right.
Or sometimes an artist will come to me and it'll go completely the other way, where they'll say, I do one work a year and I sell it for $80,000.
Sure.
And I'll say, you keep doing that, right? Because you don't have a body of work that I can compare it. I will never be able to get you $80,000 for the one work if you've got 2 patrons who are basically just paying your salary.
Yes.
To do 1 or 2 paintings a year.
Right.
When you're working with an art gallery, I need to know what your level of production's at.
Yes. Okay.
Right?
So that's
I
good to know.
don't need to control your level of production. You're a landscape artist.
Right. Yeah.
And you are highly productive in comparison to artists who do a narrative multi-figural work.
Right.
Which
is a couple a year, maybe.
Couple a year. And I'm not going to tell my narrative figurative artists, be more like, Bryan Mark Taylor.
Right.
And I'm not going to tell Bryan Mark Taylor, why don't you sit
on a painting,
6 months to create one work.
Right.
But if I know I can count on you, I will plan my shows around it.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll plan my clients around it.
So that's part of the conversation, right? Is
having,
and the artist, what if they sit there and shrug like, oh, I don't know how long it takes me. Does that kind of a red flag to you, or you kind of worry about that a little bit?
A little bit, but if I like their work, I'm willing to kind of work it out. Right.
Yeah.
And